been fascinated by the relationship between the artist and their models. Usually, the works accompany a great story. Some of the most famous pieces of art, which sometimes define the artist, are modeled portraits. Van Gogh once painted his downstairs neighbors because he couldn't afford the models. This is Joseph Roulin. I'm sure you recognize this famous Van Gogh painting of the French postman. Joseph and the member of his family, each member, sat for Van Gogh several times. That was his wife, his oldest son. And this allowed us to glean information about those times. That was his youngest son. Modeled portraits also create mysteries like, who exactly was this person? Often portraits capture a moment of time, and they offer us a rich treasure of culture by what they're wearing, what's in the background, their age or occupation. Consider Johannes de Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. This is an oil on canvas painted about 1665 during the Dutch Golden Age. Though Vermeer painted 34 paintings, this one seems to be the most popular. The young girl is wearing an exotic dress and an oriental turban. The large pearl earring created debates like, is that a pearl or a shiny piece of tin? And the work also has been known by different names throughout the decades. Portrait in antique costume, or head of a young girl, or the pearl. It's interesting, the current name, Girl with a Pearl Earring, became the title only after the first half of the 20th century. While researching this Rembrandt project, I was surprised to discover it's actually very common for the names of paintings to change. Well, how does that happen? The most common way is for a respected scholar to give a famous work his or her title, usually while writing a thesis or doing an essay, an article. From what I found, Vermeer's own notes labeled this work Girl in Costume. But if someone of respected notoriety refers to it as Girl with a Pearl Earring, then it becomes popular and it sticks. Speaking of Rembrandt, with today's racial climate, I wanted to kind of shy away from controversy, but I picked Negress lying down. That's 2020 for you. Now, the word Negress was phased out in the 60s, and I understand this could be offensive. But for the sake of this project, I ask that you grant grace and understanding of context. When I saw this sketch by Rembrandt, I wanted to dive into this work and find out all I could about this model. Lo and behold, I stumbled across not only a mystery of the model's identity, but a debate over the model's race and the title of the sketch. We're going to take a closer look at this work, this particular work, but before we look at the sketch, I want to tell you where Rembrandt was in his life at the time he sketched this model. He was 52 years old and in financial trouble. 2 years earlier, he filed for bankruptcy protection. Rembrandt wasn't just an artist, but he was an avid art collector, and he spent as much money as he took in and reportedly lived above his means. 2 of his children have died. His first wife, Saskia, also died, while their only son, Titus, was 1 year old. Because his son was still nursing, he hired a wet nurse named Gertrude Dirch. He moved in and became his lover. After a year, she took him to court because he promised to marry her, but he never would. He wouldn't marry her because when Saskia died, she set up a trust fund for Titus, which stated that Rembrandt could have access to the inheritance as long as he didn't remarry. So Dirch and Rembrandt's relationship ended in a rather messy way. Rembrandt then hired a maid, a much younger woman named Hendrike Stoffels, who moved in and also became his common-law wife. This is where Rembrandt was in life when he sketched this nude model in the studio by the candlelight. This image is close to the sketch you'll see here in the McCune Gallery. Take a moment and look at the sketch. And I want to ask everyone a question, and there's no right or wrong, it's an opinion piece. But looking at the sketch, do you think this model is a Caucasian woman? Or do you think the race is what the title says, a black woman lying down? Now I want to show you another version of the sketch. Does this affect your opinion? What do you think? Completely different first, much darker. How about the 2 of them together? Does this change your opinion in any way? Now I'm going to show you one more, and the version I'm about to show you is a photo of an etching like the one here at the McCune International Gallery that came from Rembrandt's copper plates. The copper plates were part of the collection of Paris engraver and art dealer P.F. Besson. And Besson was a fan of Rembrandt's work, and he owned several copper plates. And this is an impression published by Besson in about 1785. So what do you think? Now, if I were to show you Besson's version first, would this have influenced your thoughts regarding the rays? Now let's take a look at them together, all three of them. The top one is how you'll see it here in the exhibit. The second is kind of like a common variation that you maybe if you want to find it on a poster somewhere. It's a digital image. The third, like the first, is pulled from an actual copper plate. Because the last print comes from an etching, its relief on paper is influenced by the one who made the relief. You can see some heavy saturation around our buttocks area where there was too much ink. That's actually a trouble spot for that particular print. And while researching this 3 by 6 inch sketch, I found several for sale. And if you're curious and in the market for your own etching, then one of these sold at Christie's for just over $41,000. Each one of the authentic sketches I saw for sale had a different contrast of skin tone, which again is influenced by how the relief is transferred. So can you see how these different variations can influence the viewer's perception of the model? Let's take a look at the sketch, starting with the title, and here's what I found. The current title was given in 1797 by Australian art scholar Adam Barch. That's almost 140 years after its creation. When Barch officially cataloged his print, he mistakenly took the print he had for a black model. So 223 years later, we're still calling it by that title. Rembrandt's art dealers who sold his etchings always identified his work as a sleeping nude woman. So why the confusion? The confusion comes when the model is rendered by the shadow and not the light. The body, drawn by a very dense network of tight lines, which filters through a subtle light, makes the model emerge from the darkness. The forms of the model begin to appear without contours through different volumes of the diffused light. This tedious, very elaborate manner contrasts with the freedom of the light of the bed linen. And here's the key. The image and quality of the print varies according to the inking and wiping, which is essential in this print for creating the muscles and flesh of this model. This is what makes the model appear darker in other reliefs. Rembrandt appears to have been focusing on the model emerging from the shadows. He uses the shadows and subtle light to create the model, rather than trying to render the model lying on a blanket. This is William Pypyas, a previous director of the iconic Rijksmuseum. In 2009, they wanted to settle the dispute of the model's race, so they conducted their own research. And you can find this study on YouTube. And I've got some stills here from it. Pypyas said, when you look at the woman in the shadows, it's easy to get carried away as the shadows make her look like a dark woman, and she's wearing an oriental cap, which gives it an exotic flair. He also agrees that Rembrandt's model could have been a black woman, so further analysis was in order. So they did a photographic experiment. They recreated the scene in Rembrandt's studio under the exact lighting conditions where he did the sketch. They used a black model and a Caucasian model and then compared it to a copy of Rembrandt's sketch. Here's the black model next to Rembrandt's sketch. So the one on the top is the live model, and there's the sketch down at the bottom. And here is the Caucasian model next to the sketch. When I first saw that, I had trouble going, okay, which is which? I mean, it's like it's so close. Now here are the two live models together. And here were their findings. The skin tone of the Caucasian model, bordering against the brightness of the blanket, more closely resembles Rembrandt's sketch than the darker model on the same blanket. Also, they compared the soles of the feet. On the darker model, the soles of her feet are lighter than the top of the foot, while the soles on the lighter model become just as dark as the rest of her body. The contrast is much greater on the black model and differs greatly from the sketch. So according to Pypius, this proves this is not a black model. And I made this crude slide to show the comparison he was referring to. You see it on the right there, the darker model. The top of the foot is dark and the bottom of the foot is light. If you compare it to the sketch over there, the sketch is really dark on the bottom, and that's more consistent to the Caucasian model. All right, so I asked this question. Why are people still debating about this model in the title? Is this really a black woman and there's some cover-up or conspiracy? Also, could this have been a black woman? And when I dived into these questions, I was surprised I wasn't the first to do so. In fact, the New York Times posted an article by Nina Segal in March of this year about this very subject. And the article is named, "Dutch Golden Age Art Wasn't All About White People. Here's the proof." And the article is about an exhibit held at the Rembrandt House called Black in Rembrandt's Time. And it was an exhibit of 56 paintings, prints, and art objects. 7 of them were by Rembrandt. It's common for the Dutch Golden Age to focus on wealthy and influential white males. So this exhibit wanted to showcase the often overlooked black models and their various roles in society. Here are some of the examples from the show. I believe that's King Asper. I love this one. It's one of my favorites. And that is a boy in the turban. So, Rembrandt's 2 African men were a part of the exhibit, as well as bust of a woman. According to art historian Omer Coffin of the Rembrandt House, Rembrandt created at least 26 images of black people during his lifetime, 12 paintings, 8 etchings, and 6 drawings. Dutch artists like to paint what they see, and Rembrandt's black models were most likely his neighbors who either posed for him or he casually observed on his street. So the answer to my questions is this. Could this model have been a black woman? Yes, absolutely. Is there a cover-up or controversy of some kind? I say no, and I have not found any evidence of this. Fans of Rembrandt's work know both his models and his work are very diverse. So, and with this, who was she? After all this, who is she? So, wouldn't it be great if she just gave us a peek, turn around and say, hey, it's me, That would solve the mystery rather quickly. So who is she? Scholars believe that this is Rembrandt's young common law wife, Hendrike Stoffels, who posed for him in several other works, and she died just 5 years after the sketch was made. Well, this concludes my portion of the show. Again, I'm Jason Canady. I want to thank you for your attention and for viewing this.
Hello, I'm Kevin Hoffman, Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Religion here at Methodist. I will get to a couple of etchings by Rembrandt, and in fact, also another painting that's not in the collection. In other words, I will get to Rembrandt. But before doing so, you need to focus on my words rather than the images. I will have a PowerPoint, and we'll be talking about some images. What I'm going to be talking about actually is the Akida, Genesis 22, known as the binding of Isaac, or otherwise known as the sacrifice of Isaac. It's a common set of event that painters, various stripes and colors, actually render, including Rembrandt. And so, in a way to get at what kind of interpretation happens in painting, I need to start with a literary interpretation. The most famous of which probably is Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. His, by far, the most famous work of his is devoted to an interpretation of Genesis 22. And I'm going to give you a rough sketch of that interpretation right now. Most of us, when we approach Genesis 22 as readers, we have one of two responses. One is an unreflective acceptance or a moral offense, an outrage. It's usually one or two of these that strikes the average reader. And this is more or less where Kierkegaard begins. He's not only aware of, but specifically sensitive to these two typical responses or readings. However, he claims that each of these reactions are inappropriately distracted, one by the knife and the other by the happy outcome. Focusing on the outcome usually fosters pious, Sunday schoolish sentiments. Father Abraham, he was this great dude, he obeyed God, end of story, we can all go home and sleep well at night. Outrage over the knife is typically inspired by good old-fashioned moral humanism. So that's the second kind of response. Now, for Kierkegaard, far more important is what each response assumes about Abraham along the way. The first response assumes Abraham does not really believe he will have to or even should sacrifice Isaac. Indeed, God does not finally demand this, as the end of the story confirms. So we jump to the ending. Of course, on this reading, it's not clear whether Abraham passed the test. If it's true that he really did not believe that he would have to sacrifice Isaac, then it's not clear what test he passed, if that's what it is. The second response assumes Abraham really does believe he will have to, and in some sense even should, sacrifice Isaac. This latter is a foregone conclusion, and since Abraham apparently accepts it, the fact that the angel of the Lord stays his hand does not really mitigate his willing criminality, basically. So hence the outrage, apart from the ending. In contrast to both of these readings, here's what Kierkegaard has to say. During all this time, he had faith. He had faith that God would not demand Isaac of him, and yet he was willing to sacrifice him if it was demanded. He had faith by virtue of the absurd, for human calculation was out of the question. And it certainly was absurd that God, who required it of him, should in the next moment rescind the requirement. He climbed the mountain, and even in the moment when the knife gleamed, he had faith that God would not require Isaac. No doubt he was surprised at the outcome, but through a double movement, he had attained his first condition, and therefore he received Isaac more joyfully than the first time. Let us go further. Let us let Isaac actually be sacrificed. Abraham had faith. He did not have faith that he would be blessed in the future life, but that he would be blessed here in the world. God could give him a new Isaac, could restore to life the one that was sacrificed. He had faith by virtue of the absurd, for all human calculation ceased long ago. So that's basically the summary of his interpretation. Kierkegaard evidently thinks that Abraham believes both that he will have to sacrifice Isaac and that he will not. The divine command is correspondingly paradoxical. God commands Abraham to give up Isaac, but God also requires that Abraham fully love Isaac, explicitly promising him earthly happiness on that basis. Now, how should we evaluate someone who holds such opposing beliefs? Here, Kierkegaard offers the analogy of courage. He draws an analogy between faith and courage. I am not unfamiliar, his literary persona says. I am not unfamiliar with the hardships and the dangers of life. I fear them not and approach them confidently. But my courage is still not the courage of faith and not something to be compared with it. So his literary persona says, I don't have faith, I don't have the guts, basically. Considering this parallel more generally, it actually helps us figure out what's going on. When I go into battle, I believe I am under considerable threat. Yet I also believe that it's possible that I will live through it. This takes courage. If I think the threat is not real, that living is a foregone conclusion, then my courage remains untested, relatively easy, you might say even trivial. If I believe my death is a foregone conclusion, I will probably despair or lose my mind. So in some sense, I have to believe both. That the threat is real, I could die, but I won't die. So I really, really could die, but I won't. So how do you put both of those beliefs together? This is, I think, is a useful comparison. From another angle, to cherish my life is more or less unproblematic when there's no threat. My own value to myself might remain cavalier, even untested. Conversely, if the threat is so real, I simply give up and just stop caring whether I live or die, and then make it through. My taste for life may have drained into the ground where I lay without any loss of blood. So just think of how much you believe in the threat versus how much you think, oh, it's possible I'll make it through. If we take this a step further and apply it to sending another person into battle, so not you going to battle, but imagine sending a child into battle. Will I continue to love or despair? Hold on to or renounce? Indeed, even sacrifice the beloved. Again, your emotional sacrifice. How prepared am I to lose this person? Ordinarily, the threats that we experience are not by our own hand, right? They're from outside. Abraham holds the knife in his own hand. He is so courageously prepared to face the threat to his own happiness, he makes ready to accept his son's death by his own hand. This sounds really extreme, as it is. But this is a crucial part of the story because it forces the issue by rendering the possibility of loss especially clear and present. In going this far, Abraham must believe the threat is particularly real. He can't sort of get around it by saying, well, I don't have to do it, so it might not happen, right? He has to do it, so it really will be a actual possibility, so to speak. The possible and the actual are as close as you can get when it's in your own hand. Nevertheless, according to Kierkegaard, Abraham need not think there is an entirely foregone end to his son and his own happiness. Why not? Because a gap remains ahead of time when the outcome remains uncertain. It remains uncertain whether he will literally have to render the outcome actual by his own hand. Not only that, but even if he does, he believes that this is not the outcome, that this outcome does not settle the matter. In other words, he is saying, but it will not happen, or if it does, the Lord will give me a new Isaac, or raise Isaac from the dead, actually, is the way the letter to the Hebrews suggests this possibility. Abraham must believe something like this if he is to hold God to his promise of earthly felicity. Okay. Granting that this complex paradoxical belief structure of Abraham's, granting that this releases our beloved patriarch from the charge of murderous intent, so we don't have to go down that road, readers still want to know why it would be a good thing. What's the positive virtue in being so starkly prepared? So willing to take the time to get the rope, to sharpen the knife, and to gather the wood and climb the mountain. Here, the analogy is that much of what we rely on, both morally, mainly morally, in terms of happiness, what gives our life meaning and richness, is what Aristotle called external goods, things that aren't up to us. Aristotle says we do not altogether have the character of happiness if we look utterly repulsive or are ill-born, solitary, or childless, and we have it even less if our children or friends are totally bad or were good but have died. Altogether, our dependence on external goods unfolds a problem. These goods are beyond our control, and they can be unavailable or lost, right? So, the question then becomes, how much do we rely on them? How important for my integrity, you might say, as a human being are these things that I cannot control. Front-loading this problem, Kierkegaard insists Abraham had faith for this life. We already know that from the opening. He has faith not for a life to come, and if it was just for a life to come, as it were, he certainly would have more readily discarded everything in order to rush out of the world to which he did not belong. The child and the existence of the child is real, and must be so. And he gives, Kierkegaard does, he gives in his literary persona an alternative view of the world. The unfaithful one, as it were. The unfaithful, what does it look to not have faith? It sounds like the following. To me, God's love, in both the direct and the converse sense, is incommensurable with the whole of actuality. Knowing that, I am not so cowardly that I whimper and complain, but neither am I so perfidious as to deny that faith is something higher. I can bear to live in my own fashion. I am happy and satisfied, but my joy is not the joy of faith, and by comparison with that, it is unhappy. I do not trouble God with my little troubles. Details do not concern me. I am satisfied with a left-handed marriage in life. This is actually the characterization of what Abraham is not. In contrast, the person of faith has higher expectations, actually believes in the possibility of real, actual fulfillment, despite the odds. In comparison, a perfectly natural and sane point of view would be, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Father Abraham, it's not going to be so bad. Isaac, you got another son, you might say, right? To Abraham, that makes no sense. So the question is, actually, this is a nice Kierkegaardian question. Is he crazy, or does he have a sort of divine madness about him? The overall scenario suggests that earthly happiness depends on a schedule of goods beyond our control. The ordeal is not dissimilar to facing a terminal illness. Actually, if you think about this, we all must face death, right? But it's not certain. It's not certain tomorrow, but it's there, right? And we face it, and we can lose courage ahead of time, or face it in a faithful way. Death is not the end, you say, okay? So kind of an extreme, even crazy point of view in one light. And in fact, the specter of death haunts natality itself. Infertility regularly tears some folks so namelessly apart, their isolated grief can last a lifetime. Even without Aristotle's list, those reading Genesis 22 should already be aware of this. So if you're familiar with what happens before Genesis 22, you know that Isaac didn't arrive until Sarah was 99 years old. This happy outcome might prompt sort of Sunday schoolish laughter, like, oh, happy ending. If it weren't so heartbreaking along the way, if you think about it. 99 years. To conclude, we might not immediately or often think of our lives as a process of undespairing, though willful sacrifice as we contend with the inevitable fragility of loss and gain. Nevertheless, our fundamental human task consists in remaining young in our love and hope for the future, knowing full well and clearly that all things are born to die. How do you do both? Armed with and protected by resignation, we ourselves must brandish the knife. Yet we must not despairingly resign ourselves ahead of time. This will take courage, the courage of faith, as Kierkegaard describes it. Now, here's where things get wonderful visually. As far as Abraham goes, what might this look like? This is not Rembrandt. This is Caravaggio. And as you're looking at this, you might, it's probably the most ubiquitous, common reference point for the Akida. This is it's what I call in colloquial terms the WTF version of events. okay? It's clearly signaled that Abraham is being interrupted. He looks actually kind of mad about it. He's like, I've gotten to this point, it's been hard, but I've steeled my will, I'm ready, so don't screw with me. I've decided this is, and of course Isaac, that's exactly what we see on Isaac's face, is something's gone wrong, right? Now what's interesting about this version, Abraham is in complete despair. That's what's happened. That's the interpretation of what's going on. Now, you might say this is the rendering of events which would rightly prompt our moral offense. We find this offensive, actually, right? What's going on? You wouldn't say, here's the father of faith. Now, what's interesting about it is that Caravaggio or his cohorts didn't leave it there. Less famously, you have this one. This version of events is what I call not the WTF version, but see, that wasn't so bad. Look at Isaac's face, like, oh, yeah, that wasn't too bad. It's kind of hard to see Abraham's face, but in any case, this is more cheery, like, yep, we've gotten to the end of the story. Whew, we're done. Now, here's Rembrandt's version. What would Kierkegaard say about this version? Well, the close-up of Abraham's, the look on his face, fits actually with the astonishment that Kierkegaard describes. He is expecting to have to go through with it, but he's not exactly glad. He's more like in, what would you call it? Is it relief? Is it joy? Or maybe we have to wait a few minutes and then everybody will be joyous again. Like these images, and this is maybe the more general philosophical question that you can think about at home, is, I've just given you a kind of literary account of events. Here you have visual accounts. Is one better than the other? What do we learn from a visual account of something like this? How do you paint somebody holding on and simultaneously letting go? I think that in defense of Rembrandt's superiority on this matter, I think it's very telling that the knife is sort of suspended in midair. He's not obviously holding on to it like this. I mean, it looks like the angel, in Caravaggio's first one, it looks like the angel might not even be able to get the knife out of his hand, right? Like, I'm ready to go. Don't take this away from me. That one, less clear how hard he's hanging on to that knife. Clearly here, he's let go of the knife, which sounds good, right? But it's still there. He was hanging on to it. Just to end then, I'm out of time, is that correct? Just want to confirm. I'm good? Okay. I only have one other image that might be of interest to you. These are actual sketches from the gallery, right? Now, why are these important in terms of the story? Well, the first one, Abraham fondling the young Isaac. I think what's interesting about this is that the emphasis here is on Abraham as the father, right? You can't even imagine sacrificing that kid, right? It'd be kind of bizarre to even consider it. Nevertheless, even if Abraham doesn't have to let go himself, Abraham could lose the child. In Genesis 21, Abraham had a practice go at this letting go business. His wife Sarah asked him to send Ishmael away. Ishmael is Abraham's son from Hagar. And God actually, and Abraham was like, no way, I'm not going to send my son away. That's ridiculous. I love him. And God says, no, you got to do that. Take Sarah's view here. And in fact, he does. And he sends Hagar and Sarah out into the desert with just a loaf of bread and a skin of water. If you think about it, sending someone off into the desert, right? He doesn't kill the kid, but basically, he's facing the fact that he's going off to die. So he's had to practice go at this letting go business. The second, what can we say about the second etching? I think it's a brilliant, thought-provocative rendering. So what's happening here? Isaac has the bundle of wood to carry to the mountain here. Father Abraham has his knife in the sheath there, and they are apparently talking. What do you suppose they're talking about? What's Abraham saying? Kierkegaard, too, actually has a view of this. At the end of Fear and Trembling, one of the things that Kierkegaard asks is whether Abraham lies to Isaac. Isaac asks, if you recall, Isaac asks him a question. I see the wood, I see your knife, Dad, I see everything, but where's the sacrifice, right? That's the question that Isaac asks Dad. And if you recall, Dad says, what? The Lord will provide. Now that too has to be interpreted. Is he lying? Is he telling half the truth? Abraham's supposed to be a good dude, so we don't want him to be lying. The way Kierkegaard reads it is that he says the truth consistent with his belief. And his belief is, you have to die, but you also don't have to die. And because that paradoxical truth is so hard to render, what he does is he says what appears to be a half-truth, but it's actually the whole truth. You can quibble about whether that's good as an interpretation, right? But the painting, or the etching here, it makes you wonder, what is Abraham supposed to say to the young child, the boy? So there too, among other things, you're going to wonder what's being said. Finally, and we can end with this. This is a 20th century sketch. Who did it is not nearly as important because I'm not an art historian or anything. I just look at pictures and read books. What I like about this sketch is that it's clearly a reference to Rembrandt, but it makes it a lot messier and harder to interpret. And I'll end with this. It seems very Kierkegaardian, this rendering. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, you can decide. But I'll leave it there for your own thoughts going forward.
Okay, so I will talk about Rembrandt and the Gothic, which is, I'll talk about this pairing, obviously, throughout my presentation, but it's not a real official relationship, and I'll talk about why, but let's look at some art. So in her book, Art Through the Ages, Helen Gardner argues that quote, Rembrandt carries over the spiritual quality of his religious works into his later portraits by what we might call the psychology of light. Clearly, and that's the end of Gardner's quote. Clearly, this psychology of light is very much on display here in the McCune Gallery, as evidenced by a number of pieces, including the Flight into Egypt, a night piece that we're looking at, as seen in the tone and facial expressions of the human and animal subjects. This same psychology of light is at play in the beheading of John the Baptist, along with the chiaroscuro effect made famous by Caravaggio, who we've already seen a work from today, and the Dutch Caravagesque painters that influenced much of Rembrandt's work. These two last pieces in particular not only reveal the stark contrast of light and dark in the chiaroscuro that both artists employ, but Rembrandt's rendering of the fate of St. John the Baptist merely depicts the pregnant moment right before the fatal strike, similar to his stoning of St. Stephen, also on display here in the gallery, rather than the gruesome results. This juxtaposition of terror, a more suspenseful and psychological effect, with horror, a more graphic and physical effect, presents one of several interesting connections to the Gothic that the Rembrandt etchings here on display at the McCune Gallery possess, along with the physical use of light and darkness, the metaphorical and moral implications of light and darkness, and the continuing evolution of the Gothic across time periods, various cultures, and modernizations. Although the term Gothic has been used for centuries, stemming back to the time of ancient Rome, actually, it has historically been used as a term for archaism, similar to the label placed on the style of architecture from the late medieval period until the early Renaissance, a label that Gardner notes was, quote, used as a term of derision, end quote. From that point, the Gothic would carry with it a strong association to the medieval, and really just to a generally negative archaism in terms of a dark and superstitious bygone era. Such associations are seen in the abundance of Gothic novels that flooded the literary market during the late 18th and early 19th century, after the 1764 publication of Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. According to Frederick S. Frank, between 1780 and 1820, quote, an educated guess would be that a figure in the area of 4,500 to 5,000 novels of the Gothic variety spewed from the presses during this 4-decade reign of terror in English letters, end quote. While the literary world capitalized off of the popularity of the Gothic in novels, the art world simultaneously used the Gothic in representations of the supernatural, as seen as Fuseli's The Nightmare, as well as the gory, represented by Goya's Saturn devouring his son. These last two works again call us back to the role of terror and horror in the Gothic, as discussed with John the Baptist pieces earlier, with the terrific psychological nightmare of Fuseli and the horrific physical gore of Goya. Granted, the Gothic in the works that have been discussed so far can be viewed on one level as merely a dark aesthetic. And yes, darkness plays a key role in the Gothic, with its many metaphorical and moral associations. Darkness is inevitably connected with fear and death, as well as with evil and sometimes a negative aesthetic. And yes, absolutely, there are racial readings of these negative and oftentimes problematic associations with darkness in the Gothic. While the Gothic is generally concerned with fear, it is more specifically concerned with a fear of the other. The other is most often that which is unknown, as humanity tends to fear the unknown. Therefore, that feared other might be mysterious, immoral, or even supernatural. With all these Gothic ideas in mind, we can already see some connections to Rembrandt's work, but the fact of the matter is Rembrandt's lifespan from 1606 to 1669 puts him well beyond the Gothic of architecture, including in its 19th century revival, and also too early for the Gothic of literature and more overtly Gothic works of art during the 18th century and beyond. However, as the Gothic has spanned the early years of the Common Era right up until the present, with the current abundance of Gothic books, films, shows, and even video games, At the very least, an argument can be made for Rembrandt as having a nascent Gothic style, particularly when one considers that the term supernatural encompasses not only more typical associations with ghosts and demons, but also with religion as a whole. The Christian subject matter that Rembrandt depicts in the majority of the works hanging in this gallery are indeed supernatural, quote, pertaining to characteristic of or attributed to God or a deity, if you look at dictionary.com. And Rembrandt's etching of The Descent from the Cross is a very interesting example of this more religious form of the supernatural, as well as containing a subtle element of the Gothic. After all, this is an etching of, according to Christian belief, the Son of God being taken down from the cross after sacrificing his life for the good of all humanity. However, it is also a macabre etching of a gaunt and twisted corpse being taken down from a crucifixion in an awkward mixture of gentleness and clumsiness. The composition is really quite beautiful in its use of light and its assembly of its human subjects into a glorious pyramid, pointing up to the heavens and their celestial rays. But Rembrandt is only romanticizing and glorifying so much here. The body of Christ is not in a likewise beautiful, beatific pose of glory, but is rather fully acknowledged as a base, limp, physical human vessel deprived of life. This is actually a significant move in religious art, as Gardner points out that Rembrandt, quote, used painting as a method for probing the states of the human soul, both in portraiture and in his uniquely personal and authentic illustrations of the scriptures, end quote. She further points out of Rembrandt that the, quote, abolition of religious art by the Reformed Church in Holland did not prevent him making a series of religious paintings and prints that synopsize the Bible from a single point of view, end quote. This emphasis on a single, subjective, and personal point of view is key, as Rembrandt is navigating both his personal reading and representation of the Bible, as well as the collective experience in which viewers of these works would likewise engage. In an interesting way, this concept of personal and collective faith, belief, and experience parallels the concept of fear that is so synonymous with the Gothic. Fear is also very much a subjective, personal experience, as well as a collective experience in certain contexts. And the Gothic consistently seeks to engage audience members on both of these levels, either for the thrill of entertainment or to make a point, be that point didactic, social, moral, theoretical, etc. According to Gardner, Rembrandt's, quote, art is that of a believing Christian, a poet of the spiritual, convinced that the biblical message must be interpreted for human beings in human terms. In Rembrandt, the humanization of medieval religion is now completed in the vision of a single believer, end quote. Therefore, Rembrandt's humanization of Christ in The Descent from the Cross is not only a Christian acknowledgement of Jesus having died for the sins of humanity, but is also a personal acknowledgement that we are all mortal and will too one day be lifeless, which can simultaneously evoke faith as well as perhaps a Gothic fear of death and darkness, all of which can be seen in the divine beauty as well as the harsh Gothic reality of Rembrandt's etching. It should also be pointed out that these ideas related to one's personal and collective relationship to God and Christianity are in many ways consistent with the movements in Christian thought that had been developing throughout Europe during the Baroque period in which Rembrandt lived and worked. Also contemporary to the Baroque period were the advancements in agricultural techniques and a growing emphasis on commercialization and technical ingenuity that slowly developed during the agricultural revolution, beginning in Rembrandt's home country of Holland. This commercial and technological growth would develop further beyond agriculture during the 18th century as part of the Industrial Revolution, with advancements in factory production and in engineering. In new and interesting ways, the Gothic would be applied to depictions of industry and labor, as seen in the Hellfire of de Lutherberg's Coalbrookdale by Night, combined with the chiaroscuro effect reminiscent of Caravaggio and Rembrandt. According to William Vaughan, quote, Coalbrookdale had become a tourist attraction on account of its spectacular iron foundry, end quote. The compelling spectacle of the foundry is definitely apparent in the de Lutherberg rendering of it. However, in reference to the painting, Vaughan argues that, quote, man might be seen to be more in the character of Faustus, making a pact with the devil to gain access to supernatural forces, end quote. In recalling the story of Faust or Dr. Faustus, Vaughan conjures up these supernatural forces in direct reference to the industrial ironworks of Coalbrookdale, but more specifically in relation to de Loutherbourg's depiction of them. De Loutherbourg greatly intensifies the glow of the works in his painting, even establishing a white, hot, molten effect with the paint towards the center of the composition. As this effect used in the painting likewise greatly intensifies the red, white, and orange of the fire and smoke against the dark nighttime sky as a backdrop. Such drama makes the viewer suspicious as to whether de Loutherbourg is performing a purely scientific or objective study here. His depiction of a barrage of fire and smoke can easily be interpreted as a threatening and destructive force, in contrast to the presumably facilitative and constructive force that the ironwork should represent. Perhaps considering the effects of industrialization on the people and countryside of Britain, the more Gothic reading of the ironworks as a hellish and fearful force is just as relevant. Coalbrookdale by Night becomes even more interesting when viewed in comparison to one of de Loutherbourg's earlier works, The Angel Binding Satan. This painting can be reconsidered beyond its more obvious Gothically evil elements, as it can also be read as a combination of the Gothic and industry, as if the angel is binding Satan on an infernal bed of industrial smoke, fire, and brimstone, wafting up from humanity's burning coal fires, metropolises, and the rest of the already vast and growing human industrial complex. The billowing of the smoke and swimming effect of movement in the de Loutherbourg is similar to the Baroque style contemporary to Rembrandt, as seen in Bernini. Rembrandt himself employs a similar style in Christ driving the money changers from the temple, also in this gallery. The scene is chaotic, with human and animal bodies everywhere, again like the de Loutherbourg smoke. Furthermore, in the de Loutherbourg, human and animal body parts, Furthermore, in the de Loutherbourg, human and animal body parts billow everywhere like the smoke, with a focus towards the center of each composition on light and a figure swinging an object with violent intent. And this is, of course, an image that we've already seen twice before in the Rembrandt works viewed in this presentation. Yet, depending on your interpretation of the images in the angel binding Satan and Christ driving the money changers from the temple, the figures inciting violence are actually the, quote, good characters from a moral perspective. I actually heard an interesting discussion about that, the sort of kind of invigorating, violent interpretation of Christ and driving the money changers earlier today at in the Matthews Ministry Center. Much like the Gothic, Rembrandt's works hanging here in the McCune Gallery cover a lot of ground. As a result, both Rembrandt and the concept of the Gothic engage with a variety of different styles, subject matter, and genres. In closing her discussion of Rembrandt, Gardner addresses the fact that many of Rembrandt's works have been up for debate in terms of their attribution to Rembrandt or to one of his many contemporaries with which he often, quote, shared stylistic traits and technical methods, end quote. These debates have, to no surprise, raised a lot of controversy, as literally millions of dollars are at stake. Of course, aligning Rembrandt with the Gothic is by no means as controversial, although it does raise issues in terms of chronology, as I have already addressed. However, as Gardner points out, quote, it does remind us once again that the facts of art history are always open to review and our interpretations of them to revision, end quote. So as we wrap things up, I do want to say, please come to the gallery and decide for yourself in terms of the styles, subject matter, and genres with which Rembrandt engages. Tickets are still available, and they are required due to social distancing regulations, but all tickets are free and can be accessed at davidmccunegallery.com. So check that out on the website. And the exhibition continues until November 18th, so still plenty of time. So please come and take advantage of the fact that we have many of the works of one of the world's most renowned artists hanging on the walls of a building in Fayetteville, North Carolina. So I want to thank, of course, my two panelists, Jason Canady and Kevin Hoffman. And I want to thank you all for watching. But I also want to thank very strongly the communications department, and particularly mass communications. Paul Joseph and Kevin Swift helped me put this whole thing together in the gallery, and Silvana Foti gave us permission to do so. And their students actually have helped up with the setup and production. So unfortunately, in the world we live in now, they haven't had a whole lot of opportunity to do stuff like this. So I was happy to provide one for them. Again, seriously, thank you all.